The UK election was yesterday, and there are lots of strange things about the result that are worth unpicking. First of all, America, please note, we had an election and we knew the result the very next day. It's not that hard, so do sort yourselves out. And now that I've gratuitously alienated half the audience, the big winners of the event were, of course, the Labour Party, which now forms the new government with a sizable majority, and the Liberal Democrats, which is once again a significant force in the UK Parliament. But neither of those two parties significantly increased their vote share, which is fairly remarkable and really a reflection on how much tactical voting there was between them. It was a vote against Tories, not for Labour, not for Lib Dems. The truth is that this election, for all that it elected a centre-left party, while in parts of Europe the push is going rightwards, is actually part of the same phenomenon, because it's not a lot to do with left and right on the old scale of politics. Instead, it is a massive post-COVID-19 pushback against incumbents, one that reflects the growing gap between the promises of and the expectations on government and the actual achievable reality. At least that's a possibility that we're going to explore later in this video. But first, the election. Labour won a large majority in the same range that Tony Blair won in 1997. Unlike 1997, there's been no evidence of particular enthusiasm for Labour's programme. Indeed, Labour campaigned pretty much on the premise that the Conservatives were so obviously in line for an absolute kicking. Really, all they had to do was not mess anything up. So it's not surprising. And let's be clear, as a strategy, look, it worked. It got them the win. The turnout for the election was low, relatively to be expected when the country generally has been told over and over for the last few weeks that the result is a foregone conclusion. Why bother to turn out? Nigel Farage's Reform Party presented itself as the repository for votes against the Tories by people determinedly of the right. Labour and Liberal Democrats, and in 4 constituencies Greens, presented themselves as repositories for votes against the Tories for those more of the left. And basically, if you could persuade the electorate that you were in second position to the Tories, then you would often win. But Labour were not being swept by a wave of enthusiasm, and that showed in certain constituencies that have a high Muslim population, where Labour's position on Gaza had produced a number of independent candidates attacking them on that issue, some of whom were successful. And even some that weren't, at least reduced the Labour majority significantly in those constituencies. And if the Conservatives were the incumbents generally, arguably the Scottish Nationalist Party acted as the incumbents for Scotland. Their devastation with a loss of 36 seats, leaving them just with 9, most of which went to Labour, was the gift that Keir Starmer had most wanted. In the aftermath, here is what's likely to happen. The Conservatives will now enter a period of blame and internecine warfare. Political activists of the various wings will all conclude that if only the party had been closer to their perspective, then the British people would have rallied to their cause. It's the standard political activist delusion. Since Nigel Farage and Reform UK were taking their votes, and since the Tory base has drifted rightwards in recent years, they will almost certainly replace Rishi Sunak with someone on the right of the party. The question will then be, as I discussed in a previous video, how the dynamics will play out between them and Farage and Reform. Some will be pushing for a merger, at which point Farage maybe becomes leader, while some will be fighting that option to the death. Last time this happened, the Tories adopted non-competent candidates who had no chance of cutting through with the electorate, and they were out of power for 13 years. That might well happen. That said, Kemi Badenoch, one of the front-runners for the job, has shown herself to be more competent than those of the right tend to support. But even in that case, with a rump party of just 121, it's worth remembering that it will only take a much smaller number of MPs, around 20, to be able to trigger a leadership challenge. So whether any leader strongly associated with one wing of the party or another will be able to ride that instability for the next few years with success is a big ask. While they thrash around, Nigel Farage has dreams of replacing them as the official opposition or even the government next time. Reform UK was second in quite a few constituencies this time, so if there were a similar push against incumbents next time, they could make a real breakthrough. And he will feel that if he can be visible enough and more effective at holding Labour to account than the Tories will be, then maybe that could happen, even though Reform currently only has 4 MPs in Parliament. For Farage to be successful, he basically needs to suck the life from the Conservatives, to encourage defections to his side from amongst the Conservative MPs, and to do likewise alongside the broader party base membership. Because right now, as with any party that has almost no presence, too many of his candidates are crazies. Indeed, he had to disown several of them during the campaign. He would need to build a base of committed and politically competent people to be his core. And if the Tory party undertakes gratuitous self-harm, maybe they will give him that. But if he simply thinks that he can now just go on to attack Labour, and next time a lot of those same second-place candidates will get elected, personally, I think that's unlikely. The UK electorate still prefers parties that are at least within sight of the centre ground. If Farage is going to be successful, he will want to ride his freedom to attack the other side, while nevertheless trimming out the crazy components of his party's platform. Otherwise, Reform UK will remain a spoiler party, not a serious party. But let's get back to the bigger picture, because what's happened in the UK isn't that unique to the UK. Incumbents across the world are being challenged. France is similarly having parliamentary elections right now, in which Marine Le Pen's party has been leading the charge. Populist parties on the right have been mounting major challenges to incumbents in many places across Europe, Germany, Greece, Portugal, for instance, as well, of course, as France. Protests have been hitting governments in Africa and also in parts of Asia, such as Pakistan. The United States is a distinctive case due to its polarisation and, shall we say, the special qualities of both sides in the coming election, but there is similar energy there to some degree. And some are now arguing that this is just the aftershocks of the actions taken during the COVID-19 pandemic. During the height of the pandemic, I did a video comparing what we were doing then with what happened during the Asian flu of 1959. In the case of that pandemic, nobody much believed that governments would be able to protect them from a virus. They adjusted their behaviour to some extent, but then just got on with things otherwise. There were no newspapers running daily tallies of death counts. Nobody blamed the system when those deaths took place. It was a virus. The contrast, I said in that video, was that now people's expectations of the role of government had mushroomed to the extent where they did expect that the government should be able to protect them from the consequences of a virus. And wherever that didn't happen, then somebody must be to blame and must be held accountable. And so governments who accepted that version of their power and responsibility, they took a lot of draconian actions. Major lockdowns and shutdowns of businesses and schools and institutions took place, and so began the chain of consequences. Commerce was halted, incomes were impacted, there was supply chain chaos that created major shortages of all sorts of important things, from medical supplies to semiconductors. When those extraordinary measures passed and the economy burst back to life, all of the pent-up demand, alongside the lots of government money that had been spent, had the impact of fueling inflation, pushing prices into an upward spiral. There was no resiliency left in the system, so when a major crisis occurred with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that added even more, with energy, fertilizer and food prices soaring for many worldwide. Central banks fought against inflation by raising interest rates, which hurt businesses and families even more. And even once the rate of increase of inflation has come down, prices are still left a lot higher than they were in recent memory. And governments have massively added to their own debt levels, making it harder for them to spend on things that might help alleviate some of the problems that have been caused. And all of that coinciding with economic growth slowing worldwide, not helped by the rise of protectionism that has become a key feature of geopolitical conflict. This means that even in the world's wealthiest countries, there have been growing levels of frustration to the degree that feeds into social unrest. Citizens who had bought into the idea that they were owed safety and security as of right by their governments have realised their governments have not been able to deliver on their impossible expectations. In fact, often even not on the possible ones. More than anything else, this dynamic has led to a massive pushback against incumbents. The exact rationale for each incident depends on the personalities, the individual actions, the sensitivities and vulnerabilities for certain populations, food and energy prices in places like Pakistan, debt and proposed increased taxation in Kenya, debt and inflation in Argentina, farmers opposing stringent environmental measures in Europe, and in the UK, certainly inflation, but also the perception of incompetence in government during and since the time of the pandemic, and the killer perception that politicians set rules for everyone else to follow while lightly breaking those rules themselves, banning you from attending your grandmother's funeral while holding alcohol and drug-fueled parties at number 10. Ever since those revelations, people have just been counting down time until they could hold the people responsible accountable, even if those individuals have long since left the stage. Now there's a new Labour government, one that seems to likewise accept the size of the expectations that it has to fulfil, that inherits more national debt and a higher tax burden that it knows what to do with, and which must surely be about to suffer some serious challenges of its own. It benefited from more volatility in the UK electorate than we've been used to. After all, remember, Labour suffered its worst defeat, and the Tories enjoyed one of their best victories at the last election. Normally it would take several terms to turn around those sorts of fortunes, but it has flipped on a dime. If it did that once, presumably it can do it again. But this is the question. When you've had lots of pushback against incumbents based on a bad situation that is beyond government's ability to resolve, at what point does that stop? At what point and for what reason do citizens readjust their expectations or buy into a longer-term project that will involve short-term pain realistically for long-term gain? At what point, when societies have become enfeebled and vulnerable to external shocks, do they regain permission to start rebuilding the foundations you need to become more robust again? I don't think any of those benefiting at the ballot box right now are any better equipped to answer that question than the people they are deposing. I could be wrong, but don't imagine this is yet quite the brave new start that you might have hoped for.